While you were talking here, I went to the internet machine and I Googled what you said to Google, and I found a fantastic character by the name of TNT Todd.
Yes!
Right? So he's an FBI agent who is also a chemist, and he inhaled some gas. Now he can fly, and he has X-ray telescopic powers, disintegrating beams fired from his hands. This is an amazing character. Why would you not want to protect TNT Todd?
Comic Indie Podcast. Comic Indie Podcast. Comic Indie Podcast. Comic Indie Podcast.
Welcome to Comic Indie Podcast. I'm Ken Javier.
I'm Alex A.
And as always, I am Daniel.
And today, this is our third installment of the rebooted, can we say rebooted, gentlemen?
Yes, you can.
Rebooted Comic Indie Podcast. And today, we are going to talk about the domain, but not just any domain. We're talking about the public domain.
For the people, by the people.
We the people.
And then,
We the people. That's absolutely right. Dan, if you would drop some knowledge on us, what is a public domain?
Excuse me as I get my professor cap. Public domain means essentially that characters are free use to anybody in the public. This is true for a lot of characters as we've all know and love. King Arthur, Sherlock Holmes, Winnie the Pooh is all things that are considered public domain. Normally, quick history lesson, used to be that anything was considered public domain after 7 + 7 years. In other words, if somebody wrote something down and had it published, that was theirs for 7 years, plus another 7, depending on how things go. After that, it was public domain. Later, it became 50 years after the author's death. Nowadays, thanks to the company run by a certain mouse, the public domain has been pushed back so far that many things that should be public domain by now won't be until 2047 or something ridiculous like that. And even then, they figure it's going to be pushed back again, simply because, and this is the honest truth, the Mouse Corporate does not want Steamboat Willie to ever fall into the public domain.
Yeah, I think the date would be 2019 as the upcoming.
Right, thank you.
So they're going to be lobbying again pretty soon. I think they're already lobbying it right now.
Wouldn't be surprised at all.
So if I hear you correctly, minus all of the Disney properties and Steamboat Willie, if I wanted to write a Hansel and Gretel story, I could do so and that would be okay.
Indeed, because that was originally documented by the Grimm brothers back in the 1600s. I believe 1600s. 1600, 1800s, whatever. A lot of stories, even things that we grew up with. Here's a good one for you. Lovecraft's stories. Half of them are in the public domain. The other half are not, simply because he wrote during that, about in the 20s. So a lot of the stuff, when you can have a public domain, fungi from Yogloth, or Cthulhu at this point is pretty much public domain, if nothing else by tradition. But Arkham House and the Chaosium still have the rights to Cthulhu and the Cthulhu mythos. And they guard those rights viciously.
Okay. All right. So, public domain in comic books. That's what we're here to talk about today, though, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
For today, let's talk about some comics and how they pertain to public domain and what are some public domain stuff that we've seen here.
Two of the major comic book characters that should be in the public domain are characters like Superman and Batman, for instance. And then you also have Shazam, Mephisto, characters pretty much anybody before the 40s. They're all supposed to be in the public domain by now. Well, I mean, they're well past their time. But it seems like the debate is, should DC and Marvel still keep these characters, or should everyone own the rights?
So, is DC and Marvel, do they have the same, or I guess the same intention, or they're kind of riding the Disney wave and holding on to these characters oh so tight?
Very much so.
Yeah, I mean, this goes with every other company. So every other company that owns characters has a vested interest to keep their characters as long as their company lives. So companies, like Time Warner and Viacom and other companies that own different characters like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and pretty much everything out there.
Most things. Now, here's an interesting note, if I may be so bold. You mentioned Captain Marvel, the good old-fashioned Shazam. Here's an interesting little tidbit. Because Captain Marvel was originally, he was a competitor with Superman in the 40s and the 50s, was sued, the company fell, and DC bought out the company. Because of a certain gap in both copyright notice, reissuing a copyright notice at the time, in the certain paperwork that happened before DC acquired Fawcett Comics, the creators of Captain Marvel, any sort of Captain Marvel character and homage dating back to the 40s is accidentally public domain. Now, if you were to write a Captain America story, which I know all our listeners at home would love to do, you could, in theory, do so as a public domain character. However, the new iteration of Captain Marvel, currently called Shazam, they could press to sue you to say, no, this is our stuff, you can't use it. This is a matter of interesting legal debate because it's not so much they have the rights to the old Captain Marvel anymore. They don't. They're technically out there in the nebulous ether. However, they have the new rights to something that looks very similar to that, named Shazam, that they could press the issue on, and it has to come down to a judge to determine if that's public domain or not. The other one that goes with this is also, speaking of independent comics, one of my favorite, what you might call independent comics, is Project Superpowers. Love it. Mostly it was art by Alex Ross. I couldn't tell you who wrote it. The plot has giant plot holes you could drive a truck through, but I really clicked with the story. All it was taking all these public domain superheroes from the 40s that had completely lapsed. Things where the comic book companies that own them have been out of business since the mid-60s. And said, well, what happens if they were to appear today? How do we update them? How do we deal with them? And you got things like the Black Terror and the Owl and the Target and Masquerade, which was originally Miss Mask. They took these ideas and just went crazy with them. But they were still public domain. At the same time those were being published, AC Comics was still in business. I don't see a single thing they do, but technically they're still in business. They were releasing a bunch of the heroes based off of Black Terror, Miss Mask, the Target in their own series of books. To make things even more interesting, there is a Kickstarter right now for a comic that I've been keeping my eye on. It's called Sentinels, and he deals almost entirely in public domain characters, all of which are found on a public domain wiki with information based on whether or not these characters are still considered under rights or not. And some of them, there is a lot of gray area with. So you can have a lot of people experimenting with these various characters. I mean, I would certainly love to. One of my dreams is to drive up to Dynamite, grab him by the lapels and say, I'm taking control of this and you can't stop me, na. But I realize they have very good security, so I can't do such things. But that doesn't stop other comic creators from utilizing these heroes. Some of the times the trick is, when creating superhero comics and independent comics, is coming up with something new, something original. Well, what happens if you don't have to come up with something new and original? What happens if you say, I really am interested in the Green Giant. Now, I'm not talking about the Jolly Green Giant. He is obviously under copyright, but there actually was a hero years and years ago named the Green Giant, who was big guy dressed in green. You figure it out. What happens if you take these characters and said, I want to move forward with these? I want to work with Pyro Man, which I know sounds silly because he's an electrical power. Technically, it's correct. But what if it's, I want to work with this character and see what I can do with him? You can. As comic artists and comic writers, there's nothing stopping you. Some people might, beg to differ. DC actually released books by Wildstorm, by Alan Moore, that featured these same characters in the 90s. You could still buy them nowadays under the Tom Strong line or the Terra Obscura. But these are still completely open characters to work with.
So is there like a listing, or has like some nerd gone out there and made a website? And I'm not saying nerd in a bad way, because I would love if somebody just did this already. But can I look up these characters somewhere? Or do I just hit a Google and say public domain superheroes and whatever they show me is whatever they show me?
Actually, you can do both. If you were to go to Google and say public domain superheroes, it would take you straight to a website, pdsh.wiki.com, which is a public domain wiki that people have been developing for years.
Wow. Okay.
And this goes back, and they will show you things that you will look at and go, really? Somebody came up with this? They will also showcase, and here's another aspect to the independent comics too, for public domain. They will show you characters that were specifically meant for public domain. There is if as a person like you who does a lot of webcomics, and there is a character out there named Jenny Everywhere. Someone specifically wrote her with a copyright notice that says, this is free use. Anyone can use her or anything she's associated with. And webcomics will just grab her, make a cameo, and then she leaves because her entire character is about jumping from dimension to dimension. So it's a way of bringing webcomics together.
Yeah, and I'll actually give you the website so you can post it in the description. I know there are authors out there that actually go to these websites and they'll look up what aspects they can take. They don't necessarily take the character, for example. They'll take the storyline, or they'll like how I guess the characters look, and they'll just take that aspect. So I mean, it's you could pretty much modify it however you like. And the cool thing is, once you take these characters and you make them your own, that iteration is your own. No one else can take that from you. So in a sense, it's your copyright. So that's the same idea like with Thor, for example. You have a mythical person that was reinterpreted into Marvel's version. A guy that can fly with a hammer. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think the only thing that I'd have to consider is if these were characters that you created on your own, and say you were very profitable from them. And how I mean, I don't know. How would you like it if somebody came after you and just profited from that? And they didn't have to do anything. They just had to go through the public domain, and now they're rich.
That's the trick. I mean, the public domain was originally meant to protect people from this sort of thing for a certain amount of time. That's why initially it was life of the creator. Once they died, then it moved on to some, then it was life plus 50. It was a way of saying, okay, you get yours, but there's really not a lot of stories to go around. I mean, look at King Arthur. He is in public domain, but everyone knows the story about King Arthur, and there's a lot of evidence that it was just made up. But it's still a story that people rally around and take characters, storylines, ideas, and just play with.
Make like a really crappy Guy Ritchie movie?
Oh, yes. But a really strange comic from Marv Wolfman. Camelot 3000, if you can find it. I'm not sure if I can recommend it, but whatever. But at the same time, yeah, you want to be able to say, these are my characters, these will do what I wish. But sometimes you have a character that everyone here, a lot of people I know who's gotten into comics, have kind of said things, I'd really like to do Spider-Man. Or, you know what, if given a chance, I would love to do a Batman comic. Or even the challenge, they say, nobody can write for Superman. Well, guess what? What if you were given the chance to write Superman? What would you do? Now, when you're dealing with public domain heroes, yeah, you can't really profit off it. I mean, you can by saying, this is my story. But you're also saying, this is what I can do with this. Isn't this cool? And if you take your character and make it your own, Pyro Man suddenly becomes Electro or whatever, and you just kind of run with it in a way that it's not violating anybody else's copyright, there's nothing that can stop you from profiting on that and growing from that direction.
So I got a question for you, Dan.
Yeah.
So while you were talking here, I went to the internet machine and I Googled what you said to Google, and I found a fantastic character by the name of TNT Todd.
Yes!
Right? So he's an FBI agent who's also a chemist, and he inhaled some gas. Now he can fly, and he has X-ray telescopic powers, disintegrating beams fired from his hands. This is an amazing character. Why would you not want to protect TNT Todd? So I can now make a story where TNT Todd can hang out with my characters? Absolutely. And that's okay?
If it is under public domain, absolutely. It is one of those things that if you make a bit where you even make references to these characters or work with them in one way or the other, you can.
So as long as it's not copying someone else's iteration of it.
Yes. So
my TNT Todd is gay. Is anybody else's gay?
As long as he doesn't look like the other TNT Todd, there shouldn't be a problem.
Or he can look enough, but not too much. Now, sometimes, here's the other thing, like with Shazam, if you use the exact form from the 1940s with the horrible cape and the horrible logo, yes, you can work with that. That is actually yours to work with.
So whatever's out there, and the way that the characters look as they were portrayed in the 30s or 40s, that's okay. But if I put a beret on him, is that not okay? Because see, this is confusing now.
This is where a lawyer is always good, but at the same time, this also is a situation where I suspect that asking for forgiveness is easier than permission, particularly because you can't figure out who the heck has permission. If you had a character, like you wanted to say, a good one, like I said, Black Terror. Black Terror has had a dozen iterations in the last 10 years. I don't know why. I think it's fun. But at the same time, people from other different comics, other different corporations have pulled out and said, I'm doing a Black Terror book. You know who's currently has the rights to it? Still Dynamite, but it's still considered a public domain character. Dynamite has their version. They work with their version. And apparently they bought the rights from whatever inheritor had it down, but it's still technically under public domain. It's one of those things of whether or not they'll go after you for it. That's going to be the big trick.
Like, for example, Thor. You know how many cheesy movies there are out there that have Thor as a main character?
That's good. So Thor is public domain then. Odin is public domain
It's
then.
Greek mythology. Norse mythology.
Yeah,
okay.
And trust me, there is enough Norse religion followers out there that if they said, we own the rights to Thor, I'm sorry, but there's a lot of Norsemen out there who are well armed. Don't do this. So, everything else, that's one of the reasons why. Back to independent comics. Mage the Hero Discovered, one of my favorite independent comics of all time. He's doing King Arthur. He's using a public domain idea and revamping it to the modern day in a way that is completely original in his, and he can do with it as he will. But if they say Matt Wagner wanted to take another public domain character, he's done one or two almost. He's done the Shadow, he's done Green Hornet, he's done a lot of pulpy stuff. He could then work with that in their own ways. The Shadow is another interesting one because in theory he should have been in public domain eons ago. But somehow or another they've managed to keep him in copyright. That copyright seems to float around a lot. Dynamite's finally got it, but for years there was the idea of people said, I want to do a Shadow story. Well, who do I contact to see whether or not I can do a Shadow story? And nobody knew. So that's one of the reasons why these are really important. A lot of them is just if you do your research and you can't find out who's got the copyright for it, and again the public domain wiki helps. If you want to write something with that character, go for it. DC Comics recently took an old public domain character called the Yellow Jacket and put him into DC Comics for one panel. He's still considered public domain, even though they had him technically for a while. They could basically say this is our character from here on out. They can't.
So I guess the difference now is because back then you had people that wrote books and they had sole authors and that's pretty much it. There were no people making movies off of this stuff. There were no companies doing any other type of iteration from the book itself. So these books just became cult classics that people could later use, to reinterpret however they want. And I guess that's why there's so much of an issue now, because now you have, for example, Walt Disney. They have a friggin' theme park dedicated to Mickey Mouse. If they were to give this right to the public domain, would their park have that much more validity? I mean, if this is their main source of income.
But Alex, you pointed out to me the concept before that give it to a corporation. When you establish a corporation for your characters, this is, by the way, from the Pocket
Lawyer.
Pocket Lawyer for comic book writers. When you create a corporation, you can extend the copyright past your death or anything else like that by giving it to the corporation that still lives.
Correct. It's almost as if though the corporation is the entity.
Okay. So there's like loopholes. It's like in that casino where Robert De Niro wanted to have a job, but then they were trying to certify him as a job, and they would just do another application and do something else.
But I think the tricky thing here is copyright law wasn't written or intended to be written for corporations. It still had to follow the old rule of author plus whatever amount of years, or I think now it's 75 years.
Yeah, plus.
And now, is that 90 years now?
I think so, 90, because Superman's well past 75, and he's still under rights, so.
All right, I'm just saying, when he becomes free, my Superman is going to, talk with a lisp, and that's going to be okay.
Actually, there's been a great argument for letting these guys go into public domain, which other people on the internet have done better than I, but essentially the argument is Superman's been around for 75, 80 years. The largest argument that people have had for people who are writing stories is I could never write a Superman story. He's too good, he's too powerful, he's too whatever. Arguments that can be done away with later. If you went into the public domain, suddenly, rather than a very select few people creating Superman stories, you have anybody can do it. Can you imagine what kind of a revamp we'd have for that? And besides the fact that there are hundreds of Superman clones out there already, Supreme, Captain Marvel has been argued at this, Sentry from Marvel Comics, these are all Superman clones. What if you actually had Superman, his history, his mythos, and went to the public and said, can you guys do something better? Let's see. While still retaining the rights to produce the official Superman book. And if anybody comes up with a Superman story that's just too good, what do you do as a corporation? Give that guy a job.
Yeah, but what if you get somebody that does do a better job at Superman that's a completely different interpretation than what DC does, and now DC is losing money from their Superman books?
Well, sort of. Everyone knows DC and Superman go, hand in hand. That's been true since the 70s. But think about, again, Supreme. Rob Liefeld said for the record, Rob Liefeld has never done an original character in his life. He's stolen everything from everything else.
Now, Supreme, just to bring up, that was a Malibu property, and that was the guy where he was like a Superman, but then his body turned into gel. And
oh no, that's Prime. That's what you're thinking.
Prime.
Prime.
Oh, never mind. But he was also very Superman-esque, but then his
Very
body
much so.
turned into Jello or something.
Well,
he was a nerd underneath or something.
And that was such a great interpretation of the Captain Marvel mythos. Right. Again, working with something that should be public domain, did it in such a way that's different and played with it. Because it was a little kid pretending to be a superhero, even though he had superhero-like powers and an adult body. Supreme was Rob Liefeld saying, I want a Superman that kills. So he wrote a Superman that kills in a white outfit, white hair, red...
Oh, okay, I remember, yeah, okay.
Totally pathetic.
It was pretty much the clone for Superman, just the evil version.
Yes, until Alan Moore was called in. They said, hey, we can let you do anything you want. What do you do? Alan Moore said, I want these characters. And he told what is considered to be some of the best Silver Age Superman stories through this character in a modern lens that anyone's been able to see in years.
Oh, so Alan Moore did Supreme.
He did Supreme. He did 3 books of Supreme, and they are, I've got to say, marvelous. When he finally gave Rob Liefeld the finger, he went off to take these characters and these ideas, and he turned them into Tom Strong and Promethea, and they began the birth of the America's Best Comics line that Alan Moore did, which, by the way, America's Best Comics is a failed comic industry that created a lot of public domain superheroes.
No kidding. So, wow, that's amazing.
Small
that's
world.
Amazing. Okay. Because now that you keep on throwing Alan Moore's name out there, did he do God, who was that guy? He was a hero that was kind of like Shazam, but he said Komodo or Atomic backwards.
Miracle Man.
I went to the comic book store one time looking for the book Starlight, right? The comic book guy was all like, Starlight's garbage. Read Atomic Man or Miracle Man. It's much better. And I still like Starlight, by the way, and but you know what I'm talking about, right?
I think I know the book.
That's basically if Flash Gordon were to get really old and his sons don't love him anymore, and then he goes back to save a planet, in his heyday. So it's like one of those I'm getting too old for this mess type things, and he goes for one last payday kind of situation.
I do not know this book. To the video store.
But anyways, Miracle Man is Miracle Man public domain?
Okay. Excuse me, I gotta put this can of worms down. Here's the really quick and dirty if I can do it. Because this has been something that was legal nightmare and beautiful legal legend for literally 2 decades. Okay. Miracle Man is literally Captain Marvel that a British company wanted to do. Basically, the old days when you had surplus issues of various comics, you would send them overseas so they could get it bundled together, kind of like in a graphic novel form. Well, they ran out of Captain Marvel comics too fast, and they said, well, what do we do? What do we do? Well, they hired somebody to create an exact character called Miracle Man, with young Miracle Man and kid Miracle Man, and they thought very much, it was almost exact copies of stories about Captain Marvel. Well, that kept on for a long while, and then they kind of faded out, but it was considered in the British zeitgeist, as you will. That was their Superman for a long time, was Miracle Man. Sorry, it was originally called Marvel Man. I apologize. He was Marvel Man. Well, Marvel came into the industry, said, no, you can't do that, particularly when they started sending the books from England back to America. They sued. They said, we own the rights to the word Marvel. You can't use it. They said, fine. They changed it to Miracle Man. In walks in a young comic book writer who'd only been doing one-shots and things for 2000 AD named Alan Moore. He said, I'll write this. I need a job. And he wrote a complete deconstruction of both the superhero myth and the idea of having more than one body. It is fascinating and interesting, and it is dark as heck. However, they wanted to bring it to the States. They did for a long time under the Eclipse imprint. Eclipse used to re-release the printings from Britain to America. And Alan Moore got to a certain point where he said, you know what, I'm done with the character, I'm doing other stuff. And that's when he went to go off to do V for Vendetta and Swamp Thing and so forth. He then turned it over to a nice young protege named Neil Gaiman, who then
American Gods and Sandman. Okay.
Yes, apparently they're good friends. And he took it and took it in a different role about, well, once you have a Superman character, can he build a utopia from that or becomes a dystopia from that? That story never got finished. Why? Marvel sued. And so between the original creators, which also splintered off in England, and Eclipse Comics, nobody knew who had the rights to what. Well, they managed to cobble together enough of the rights, except for one holdout who had bought an entire group of comics and said, I own the rights to Miracle Man, or at least enough of it that prevents you from working. That person's name was Todd McFarlane, creator of Spawn. He wanted to write Miracle Mans for himself. Thank God he didn't. And he said, I own the rights. You can't stop me. And they said, yes, we can stop you. We own the rights. This literally went to a 20-year fight. For those in the know, Neil Gaiman, so desperate to get the rights back, did the book 1602 for Marvel to fund the legal case against Todd McFarlane to get the rights. Eventually, Todd McFarlane relented, lost the suit, and said, this is what I had, and all he had was rights to the logo. And that was it. So after that was done, now Marvel, through legalese and whatever, got their rights to the book and have been releasing them ever since as graphic novels. So they've slowly been releasing the individual books from the 80s run that Alan Moore did. They've been doing it for a couple of years now. I don't know where they are anymore, but they've been doing the full run with the idea that Neil Gaiman, near the end, is going to step back up and say, okay, I'm doing it. By the way, also for your aficionados, Alan Moore created the character of Angela for Todd McFarlane for Spawn. Todd McFarlane said, I own the rights to Angela, and Neil Gaiman literally held up his contract and says, anything I do for you is owner created. And to give his opponent the finger, Neil Gaiman brought Angela to the Marvel Universe and said, she's all yours.
Yeah, actually, I have that issue of Spawn, so very, very much treasured, and I have the toy as well. So if I hear you correctly, I cannot make a Miracle Man with a lisp or any type of other defect, so he makes him my own Miracle Man.
You'd have to really get into that. But like I said, Miracle Man in of itself is a copy of Captain Marvel. So just having someone who says a magic word and goes from child to adult or weakling to a strong person, it doesn't matter. The idea is there. Run with it. Just name it your own, give it a bit different costume, and play.
My guy's going to say, whoop, there it is. And he's going to get very big and strong. And I'm sure Tag Team would appreciate the shout out.
There you go. I don't think they're desperate for money. But,
whoop, there it is. You're welcome, Tag Team.
Yeah.
All right. For Comic Indie, I'm Ken Javier.
This is Alex A.
And then again, I'm Daniel.
And you've been listening to Comic Indie Podcast. Thank you.
Comic Indie Podcast. Comic Indie Podcast.